Okay, as people come through the door, I'd like to welcome everyone back to Ammonia Energy Live. It's been a few months off, but it's great to return to this series where we explore the wonderful world of ammonia energy and the role it's going to play in global decarbonisation with a bit of an Australian twist. Very first off, I want to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. I'm coming into you from Bunurong country in Melbourne, and I extend that acknowledgement out to country wherever you're dialing in from Australia and around the world. The energy transition in Australia is going to require land and lots of it. The rollout of infrastructure will be immense and will need to be located in some of the most remote areas of the country. A critical juxtaposition here is that about 40% of Australia's landmass falls under native title. Many of these remote areas already have First Nations communities living and working on them. There won't be a clean energy revolution without the involvement of these communities. And the opportunity is there for First Nations people to play a leading role in our energy transition if engagement is done properly. So to explore this issue, we're joined by Lily O'Neill, Senior Research Fellow at the University of Melbourne. Lily has published several key studies on agreement making and negotiation with First Nations communities. And with the other authors, she has helped set out guidelines for developing best practice in the space. Please submit your questions via the Q&A function you see at the bottom of your screen. You can upvote and comment on each other's questions if you like. We do have a number of good pre-submitted questions lined up for Q&A, and we encourage you to keep sending through questions for our speakers when you register. It's the easiest way to make sure they're answered. We'll also put a recording of today's episode on our YouTube channel ASAP after we finish. So without further ado, let's get into it. Hi, Lily. It's great to have you here. Firstly, can you introduce yourself, and can you tell us how you came into the decarbonisation and clean energy space?
I'm coming to you from Tangerang country. I live in Bright in northeast Victoria. I'm clearly the mother of two small children, 1 3 and 1 5. They're both at home sick today. They will certainly soon have the TV turned off for them if they don't start complying. How I got into the decarbonisation space. I did my PhD on agreement making for native title land. And I did that in relation to mining companies. And I did that, look, not because I like carbon, I certainly don't, I'm an environmentalist, but because it's just such a interesting area and such a cracking yarn really of traditional owners negotiating with mining companies. I came to it as a lawyer. I was a lawyer for maybe 8 or 9 years with Morris Blackburn, and I find negotiations really interesting. And then I switched to the good side clearly and now work in decarbonisation.
Excellent. So I'm curious, how did your affinity with First Nations research first develop?
I worked for Marcia Langton, basically. I was a law student, you know, like many people growing up in the southern states of Australia. I was probably 20 and thought I'd never met an Aboriginal person. I later discovered that, of course, I would have met Aboriginal people. And I worked for Marcia Langton, and she, you know, opened my eyes to essentially what is the, you know, the first huge injustice in this country with how we treat Indigenous people. And as I've become, you know, a lawyer and then a researcher, particularly in the climate space, what's becoming more and more apparent with the research is that when you work in this space, as I do, it's part of it is about righting wrongs and ensuring that First Nations people have their rights recognised. But more importantly for all of us is just that the climate crisis, First Nations people have so many fabulous solutions to the climate crisis. And that's something that's probably not quite recognised enough yet. And the land that they have is so rich in biodiversity and has wonderful conservation values, and Indigenous land management holds real promise for, you know, climate repair and storing carbon, and, you know, fire stick farming has wonderful promise in terms of, again, storing carbon and, you know, avoiding carbon through carbon, you know, and people can buy these wonderful carbon credits that, you know, the Kimberley Land Council, for example, sell, where they do early cool season burns in the Kimberley Kimberley and save all this greenhouse gas going into the atmosphere. So I think that story probably isn't told quite enough, and I think it's something that really needs to be emphasised, is that, you know, the more we look to First Nations communities for their ways of managing land, the better off we'll all be. Does that answer your question, Julian?
Yeah, it does. Excellent, excellent. So I guess we'll move on to your research and your findings now. So Indigenous First Nations engagement for clean energy projects, what were the key findings and recommendations that you came across?
Yeah, it's a good question, Julian. And so I'll start just a very brief history lesson, and apologies for all of those who understand this already. So from 1788, we had, you know, British colonialism, and for the first few years, the legal position in Australia was sort of pretty unclear. And eventually people started to say, well, no, we didn't need a treaty. No treaty needed to be signed with Aboriginal people because they never owned the land anyway. That position continued, as many of you know, until 1992 for the whole of the country, when the seminal decision of Mabo came out and recognised that Aboriginal people, you know, do and did own their own land. And it started a little bit earlier too, in places like the Northern Territory, where we had land rights from the 70s, the mid-70s onwards. So that's where Aboriginal people, sorry, I've just had one more interruption. Please tell me what your question was again, Julian.
No, it's all right. The key findings and recommendations of your research.
Yes. Apologies. So the Native Title Act, which is the legislation that covers most of Australia, and is not quite as strong as some of the land rights legislation in terms of giving rights to First Nations people across the country. It's not quite as strong. It was drafted in a slightly different era, and it covered the whole country rather than just pockets of the country like land rights legislation, which was earlier. Really was drafted so as to allow things to occur. It was drafted so that mining could occur. It was drafted so that pastoral leases wouldn't be threatened. Essentially, it was this huge compromise. The Mabo decision had just come out. Paul Keating wanted to legislate for land rights, for native title, and the whole thing was a massive compromise. So native title gives First Nations people some rights, but not that many rights. And in the Native Title Act, there's a scale of different things that occur on land that are known as future acts. Some of you may know about. And according to the level of future act that occurs, the act gives certain, what we call procedural rights. Now, these procedural rights are not very strong. The strongest one is called the right to negotiate, and it's for mining. And it merely says that First Nations people have a right to sit at the table with miners and try and negotiate agreement for 6 months. And if no agreement has been reached, the mining can occur anyway. And some of you may have heard about Fortescue in relation to a large mine on Yinjirbandi country in Western Australia. They simply refused to come to an agreement with the Yinjirbandi people, and that's proceeding through the courts at the moment. But the Solomon mine continued anyway. For wind and solar farms on native title land, it's a bit unclear what level of rights apply. Why? Because wind and solar farms weren't thought about when the Act was drafted in 1992. On one view, native title holders have very low level rights when it comes to these sorts of things. On another view, an Indigenous land use agreement has to be signed. And, you know, we're all waiting for a court to come to a decision about that. I can tell you there's nothing in the offing, so we may be waiting 15, 20 years. That history lesson is just to say that Aboriginal landholders don't have very strong rights under Australian legislation. And so what that means is best practice has to go above those legal rights. It just has to, because it's not only legal obligations that companies have to adhere to, you have to adhere to, your ESG obligations as well. You have to negotiate a social license with people. That is just the reality these days. And so, some of you will have seen the case, the Barossa gas field, Santos, that the federal court handed down last week, which said that Santos had not consulted properly, and Santos had not fulfilled their legal obligations, the court said. Now, what I can say to you as a lawyer is those obligations, those legal obligations, are very low. You just have to have someone who knows what they're doing in their communities branch to really tick that box. The fact that Santos stuffed that up says a great deal about their community process. The bigger point is that it's not just legal obligations you want to be fulfilling, it's going above and beyond those. And that's why we wrote a guide setting in plain language and a fair bit of detail what going above and beyond legal obligations looks like, because your legal obligations are just not going to cut it. That guide is on the First Nations Clean Energy Network website, with a forward from Karina Nolan, who's the head of one of the founders of the First Nations Clean Energy Network. And, I really encourage you all to have a look at that, about, what your legal obligations are and why it's necessary to go so far above that. Noting that companies like Santos don't even fulfill their legal obligations, which are so low. What were they doing? Come on, guys, it's not hard. Does that answer your question?
Yes. Oh, no, that's good. That's an excellent layout of what the issues are and what the situation is. Another concept that it might be useful to just quickly explain here is free, prior, and informed consent.
Yeah, absolutely,
if you could.
Julian. Yeah. Yes. So free, prior, and informed consent is an international, you wouldn't call it a law, you call it slightly less than a law, principle, you probably call it, laid out in several different international treaties, and most particular in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And essentially what free, prior, and informed consent says in that international treaty is that First Nations people around the world, I should say Indigenous people around the world, groups are called very many different things in different countries. In Australia, Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander, First Nations people is sort of catching on, but First Nations people in Canada refers to a specific set of people. It doesn't refer, it's not the generic term. Anyway, so in the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, it says that when actions are taken in relation to Indigenous people's land, they should be given the opportunity to provide their free, prior, and informed consent. Now, free means free from coercion, the ability to say yes. Prior is a really important part of that, and we see it coming up all the time. I get complaints from traditional owners on the ground. I know that the First Nations Clean Energy Network gets complaints on the ground of people just hearing, and this is happening a lot in relation to these very large wind and solar farms, traditional owners hearing in a press release that there's going to be a very large wind and solar farm on their country. And that's the first they've heard of it. We're hearing that more and more. And so the press release might say wonderful things about what the project is going to mean for these traditional owners, but it's the first they've heard about it. And that certainly doesn't fulfill that prior aspect of free, prior, and informed consent. That, the landowners, whether they're Indigenous or not Indigenous, whether they're the farmers, should be the first people you talk to, because I'd argue that the land is the most essential part of the development. Now, the informed part is about information, and it's about ensuring people have enough information to be able to make an informed decision. And that can mean different things for different people in different communities. For a lot of communities, it means the ability to be able to employ a lawyer, for example, to be able to employ maybe an industry expert, to be able to get independent, unbiased advice. Not to say that, you wonderful company representatives are giving them biased advice, but the ability to afford to pay someone independent to give you unbiased advice is really valuable for people to be able to come to a decision knowing that they are, have all the information, on their plate. And, if you think about it, traditional owners own their land as a community. These are community rights, and they include all the people that, you know, are included in your community, Julian, in my community. You know, I've still got a 97-year-old grandmother. Would I want her negotiating without proper information with, you know, a multinational European company seeking to put a wind and solar farm on her property? No, I would not. No, I would not. So that's what free, prior and informed consent means. Is it the law? No, it's not the law. It's not the law in Australia. And various shades of governments are constantly reminding Indigenous people in Australia that it's not the law. But yes, it might not be the law in Australia, but you never know what those crazy Europeans are going to do in the European Union, you know, in terms of, you know, what they implement, what requirements they have of energy coming in. And certainly free, prior and informed consent is absolutely the highest standard that Indigenous communities expect. And so if you're a company that says, hey, you know, we've successfully engaged with this community to a high standard, a standard high enough that, you know, they would agree it's been free, prior and informed consent, you'd certainly have to say that if any, you know, requirements from the EU, from Canada, whatever, for your company's products are put in place, you could say you're already meeting those. I think is an important thing to think about.
Okay, that's very interesting. It sounds like the conversation going around is going on around certification at the moment, and almost a social certification for your project for entering a jurisdiction. With the we'll stick with the question on what are the risks of a botched project or a rushed experience, especially for an emerging industry. Yeah.
Oh gosh, yeah. Well, so most of in 2020, in the middle of 2020, when Rio Tinto blasted thousands of years of cultural history so they could, you know, expand their mine at Juukan Gorge. And I'm sure all of you also remember that it was something that they were legally allowed to do under Western Australian heritage legislation. And they were also legally allowed to do under their Indigenous land use agreement that they had negotiated with the local people, the PKKP people. What happened, of course, is that Rio Tinto had been for 15 years prior. What had happened with Rio Tinto is that they had, in Bougainville, in Papua New Guinea, in the 80s and 90s, they had really trashed the local community and the local environment, and they'd also trashed their reputation in the process. After Bougainville, Rio Tinto made this huge concerted effort to repair their reputation. They employed all the best community people. From the CEO down, they said, we're going to do the right thing now. What happened in the last few years prior to Juukan Gorge, as the parliamentary inquiry would later find out, was that there was a new CEO, a lot of the old communities people left Rio Tinto, were forced out. They shifted their communities branch to London. And so that reputation that Rio Tinto had, which was hard won through hard graft and had resulted in all sorts of awards for them. There's a very prominent human rights benchmark that had Rio Tinto listed not just in the top tier of mining companies, but in the top tier of companies around the world for their adherence to human rights standards. And Rio Tinto lost that in an instant. They lost it in an instant. Not only did they lose it, but the human rights certification standard organisation also lost it. They said, we've just done this so badly. If we had continued to give Rio Tinto such high marks and they were doing things like blowing up Juukan Gorge, then we need to rethink the whole way we do things. Not only did Rio Tinto get tarred with this brush, of course, but BHP's submission to the Juukan Gorge inquiry says this has impacted us too. We are not Rio Tinto, we're their competitors, but we are seeing from our shareholders, from our, our institutional investors like super funds, we are seeing a blowback. So Rio Tinto went from having this wonderful reputation to having this awful reputation, and it also trashing really the industry for a while. It trashed the whole industry. All of you will know, I'm sure, that the institutional investors forced the resignation of the CEO of Rio Tinto and several other senior executives. So, and again, this goes back to what I was saying earlier about legal rights, is if you're relying on legal rights in this country to say that you're doing the right thing by traditional owners, you've got the wrong end of the stick. And, you know, you may not end up being Rio Tinto and being the subject of a parliamentary inquiry and losing your CEO, but you're playing with fire. And, you know, for a new emerging industry like ammonia, you're particularly playing with fire because people don't know that much about it. They probably can't name drop like you can with Rio Tinto and BHP, the names of the companies. I certainly couldn't name drop any ammonia companies. And so one ammonia company in the minds of institutional investors and communities, they're probably, you know, interchangeable. So, you know, you do the wrong thing, you know, you'll have an impact on your competitors, which maybe is not such a bad thing for you, but you're having an impact on the whole industry. So particularly for emerging industries, it's so important to be doing the right thing. So important.
Okay, interesting. Good. Very, very good messages. Switching gears, can we consider the opportunities of proactive engagement? What are some of those good opportunities?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, of course. And, you know, I think we have been seeing examples of this, certainly in some of the really large scale wind and solar farms that have been in FR. The Asian Renewable Energy Hub, just bought out by BHP, for example, the Western Green Energy Hub, Western Green Hub in, you know, Southwest Australia as well, have been. Certainly, we don't know any of the details yet of their agreements with traditional owners, but they've been putting out some very good press releases about what they intend on doing. You know, equity shares, you know, it being transformational is some of the language that's being used with traditional owners. So that bodes well. Having said that, I don't know what's in the agreements, but being proactive, I think, is so important because it can have this, and it goes back again to what we're talking about with free, prior and informed consent. Being proactive means you go there early. You go there before you've pegged out, you know, the areas that you're going to put, you know, your production facilities on, or your wind and solar farm, or you go there early and you talk to people. And you can do some really good community work that way, because remembering, again, these are communities, they're made up of diverse people. There's usually quite a lot of people who have to come to decisions. So the earlier you go, the more likely it is probably that you're going to get consent, because people have had enough time to think about it. But also, you know, the kind of creative aspects to a development in terms of what the community want for their community out of it, in terms of jobs, what they look like, what kind of training they want. You know, there's all sorts of benefits in that. Also, look, we're all going through a skill shortage, aren't we? I can't find a babysitter for my kids. And I'm sure, you know, in remote Australia, it's extremely, you know, if you're going into remote Australia, there's people that live there. And those people are often, you know, in pretty entry-level jobs, but calling out for higher level jobs. And so to skill people up, I'm sure bodes very well for your business. Look, and also the flip side is for your, you know, your non-Indigenous employees, being a company that, you know, is one you're proud to work for, always helps people retain people. You know, you always want to be working for someone who's doing the right thing most of the time. Look, bearing in mind too, I'm married to an engineer, and he would say that's not an issue for him, but anyway.
All good. And that's actually very interesting. That sort of semi-answers my next question. In terms of the workforce for a massive rollout of clean energy, First Nations communities in remote areas, is this low-hanging fruit for actually recruiting a workforce that we need?
It's interesting, that term of low-hanging fruit. It's a very HR term. And the short answer is maybe yes and maybe no. It depends what other industries are in the area already. When you're talking about areas like the Pilbara, you know, there'd be many companies that say, you know, we've got X amount of positions open for, you know, local Aboriginal communities, and they're just not getting filled. Having said that, and look, I go back to Rio Tinto's glory days here. Rio Tinto ran this wonderful program to employ people in the Pilbara that Marcia Langton did a lot of research into. And it looked at, okay, so you've got the so-called low-hanging fruit, you know, the university, tertiary educated people who are really job ready. They're already employed. You know, how do you get the harder to employ people on there? And Rio Tinto ran this wonderful program where they mentored people. They made sure each worker had a mentor. They had HR policies that were conducive, you know, were culturally aware, and ensure that there's a term called culturally safe, that ensure that the Aboriginal workforce felt culturally safe. They had cultural awareness training, not only both ways. So Rio Tinto would teach the local community about their culture, and the local community would teach Rio Tinto from senior executives down about their culture. You know, there's other things that, you know, can make people feel, you know, more at home in a workplace. For a lot of Aboriginal people, the really appalling thing is, as we all know, the stats show that they will need to be going to more funerals than non-Indigenous people. It's just a fact. Having more funeral leave, and funerals are really important. Having more funeral leave in your company is something that you should be aware of. Things like that. So is it low-hanging fruit? It depends where you are. Is it important to do? Yes. And there's some laid out ways of doing it. It takes a bit more probably effort and imagination, but I think, you know, bears real fruit. And what Marcia Langton's research into the Pilbara showed during the mining boom was that having a good job was the quickest way to close the gap for these communities. There was a whole lot of questions that got asked of Aboriginal workers in the Pilbara, and they were almost on par with their non-Indigenous counterparts. And isn't that, you know, this wonderful thing that we should all aspire to, you know? And the green energy transition, you know, it could be like every other transition and, you know, continue to entrench inequality. But wouldn't it be wonderful if, you know, and a wonderful news story too to shareholders, if, you know, doing the green thing was also doing the good thing by communities.
Yeah, exactly. Excellent. I find myself nodding along.
Oh, good.
Let's we'll keep going for another 10 minutes. We've hit the half hour, but I'll just keep moving through our questions.
Been a bit interrupted at my end, haven't we, Julian?
It's all good. It's all good. If we look ahead 5 or 10 years, where do we need to be in Australia, do you think?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think if we look to Canada and what's going on in Canada, there's some really good initiatives there. So in Canada, First Nations people and Inuit people and Métis people are really some of the leaders in community and medium scale wind and solar. And I don't know anything about ammonia production in Canada with Indigenous peoples. I apologize for that. But so in terms of the communities in Australia, we would like to be seeing communities not just being, you know, the people the industry comes to and says, we want to use your land. It would be great for communities to be the ones going out to industry and saying, we want to be partners with you. We don't just want to be passive landholders who receive benefits. We want to have equity shares. We want to be pushing these sorts of developments. And, you know, the wonderful news story about this industry and the clean energy transition is that it's very in keeping with, you know, the world, you know, First Nations worldview, you know, about living sustainably and not leaving a big footprint and ensuring there's enough for future generations. It could be a real win-win. So, but that's certainly what we'd like to see in 5 to 10 years is more ownership of these sorts of developments by First Nations communities, and you know, there being a far more equal footing, because, you know, as I'm sure a lot of you know, in the mining industry, as I said at the start, the law doesn't set out a level playing field, and certainly, you know, the corporate conglomerates that come along ensure there's not a level playing field. So personally, what I'd like to see is a much more level playing field. And I think, you know, please all look up the First Nations Clean Energy Network. It's a really good network for ensuring that happens. There's some really great things going on the ground.
Well, and that leads into, I think, my last question for our conversation, in that what are some good next steps, first steps? What are some good resources people can be looking up?
There'll be, we at Melbourne Climate Futures will be putting out some more resources soon. I will just make a plug, in fact, for some research we're about to do, we're in the middle of doing, which is what we're trying to do is document, so I'll go back a step, apologies. A lot of what happens in this area is negotiated between traditional owners and companies, and it goes into an agreement. It's a legally binding agreement, and that agreement is usually confidential. And so researchers like me hear people tell me about what's in these agreements, but I have no real ability to look over that. And look, I'm a lawyer by training. I like to, it's all very well to hear what people say about what's in the agreement. I like to see it myself. Project that I'm doing for Marcia Langton and Jackie Peel, who's a world-leading environmental lawyer, is going around the country and asking people, like the people who are listening, show us your agreements. You know, we'll take them on a very confidential basis. We'll treat them very confidentially. But if you have an agreement with traditional owners on any aspect relating to climate repair, carbon farming, fire stick farming, solar and wind, any kind of Indigenous land use agreement or type agreement, we would love to see it, and we'll be very confidential with it, and we'll sign agreements, etc. But if anyone does have an agreement like that or would like to talk to me about that project, please get in touch. My email address is available on the Melbourne University website. I would love to hear from you. We want to know what's happening in this space because we just think it's so important, and it's undocumented at the moment. And particularly, there's a lot of good companies doing good work, and it's undocumented.
Excellent. I will make sure your email goes out in some form in the materials I send out after. Okay, so that's excellent. We've got time for a couple of questions, a couple of pre-submitted questions, and then we'll wrap. One of them is from Rolf, and he's asking about whether the data that you're collecting for your research is quantitative or qualitative. And I think that's an interesting question, is what's your research approach like when you're doing this engagement stuff?
Of course. And look, my approach is mainly qualitative. I go and I talk to people and I find out what's going on. Having said that, I work with a lot of people who do quantitative work. Some of my colleagues at the ANU, where I was previously, have done some really good work on disconnection of electricity in Northern Territory towns. That's quantitative. I'll take a third category and say legal analysis as well is something I do a fair bit of. And, you know, if any of you want to give me your agreements, that's the kind of analysis I'll be doing on that, will be legal analysis. It's a really good question, Rolf, but I certainly find that sitting down and talking with people is the best way, and talking to lots of people from all categories of developments is the best way of finding out what's going on. And generally you find, you know, it takes you about 3 people to talk to, and then you have a bit of an understanding of what's going on.
Okay, excellent. We've touched on it a little bit throughout the conversation, but what are some of the policy bits that are required moving forward? It can be federal or state, up to you.
Yeah, so look, the law always needs to be strengthened in this area. There's no question. There's some really key reforms of the Native Title Act that really should go through. I think I spoke a little bit earlier about the uncertainty about how wind and solar farms are treated under the Native Title Act. It'd be great if that was made more certain and rights were, you know, tightened for traditional owners. The First Nations Clean Energy Network is also recently, in the last month or so, received some funding and the tick of approval from the Federal Minister, Chris Bowen, to undertake planning, strategic planning for First Nations clean energy around the country. That will be happening. There'll be some meetings around the country from about December onwards. And coming out of that will be a really clear, specific, detailed First Nations clean energy strategy. And, you know, that will encompass huge parts of the country. So that'll be something that those of you who do business on First Nations land should keep their eye out for. And look, I think that's a really positive thing. You know, I know the people who are running that national planning, and they're very pro clean energy. There's no people trying to wreck this process. Everyone's on the same boat. So that's a really positive thing.
Right. right. Excellent.
So,
Excellent.
but there's always the need for government to step up a bit more and do a bit more in relation to communities. Far too often, companies are asked to, fill the shoes of governments. They shouldn't be companies providing primary school education. It should be government. But that's a different topic.
Okay. All right. Excellent. A question from me that I want to pose to you. It's a bit of a tricky question. It's the one-year question. Is that in this space, the ammonia energy space, we're starting to see community opposition to big hydrogen and ammonia projects overseas. There's been an issue recently with carbon capture and storage licenses in Louisiana, an Indigenous land acquisition for renewable energy generation in Chile.
Yep.
Is this inevitable? Is that community opposition inevitable?
Oh, I wouldn't have said so. I wouldn't have said it's inevitable. I mean, it depends on the nature of the development. And there's always NIMBYs around. I mean, I'd say it's more likely to be inevitable when you're in an area that has lots of NIMBYs in it. I'd say it's much less likely to happen on Aboriginal land if you're doing all the right things. If you're working according to best practice, I'd say you're far more likely to have community approval on land subject to First Nations rights and interests that in, I mean, you wouldn't even try, would you, in, Double Bay in Sydney? Far too many NIMBYs, land too expensive too. But no, I don't think it is inevitable. I don't think it is inevitable. And I think any company that says that it is inevitable clearly hasn't invested enough in the community branch. And when I say invested, I don't just mean employing the right people. I also mean that the people they employ, have a line up to the CEO to make sure that they're not just, the sort of the nice fuzzy people at the side while, the engineers and the proper people get on with the work. When Rio Tinto was at its best, one of its best community practitioners was an engineer, was a mining engineer. And he did it really well. And he did it really well because he was respected throughout the company. And so what he said had real sway. And that's really important. That's really important because it goes from the CEO down. And having a CEO who's on board with doing the right thing is so important. So no, I don't think it is inevitable at all.
It's interesting
I was just going to say, we've seen a lot of opposition in Mexico to very large scale wind farms in particular. And look, even the most rudimentary analysis of that shows that their processes were just appalling. They forced people into signing these atrocious agreements that were not translated into local languages. They were, really using divide and conquer approaches. We call it the extractive approach in my area, i.e. it's what the bad mining companies do. So yeah, I don't think it's inevitable at all.
Okay. And it's interesting, that goes to a point you made earlier about what if, and that actually came up at our recent conference, what if you can move to, instead of a not in my backyard, to a yes in my backyard?
Absolutely.
To actually have people approaching.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, please go and have a look at the First Nations Clean Energy Network website, because that's what a lot of the communities are saying. Yes, in our backyard. Yes. They've got people, they're talking from Borroloola, which is in the middle of the Beetaloo Basin. They're saying no to fracking, and they're saying, why aren't we having more clean energy projects around here? So absolutely. Good point, Julian. Great point.
Excellent. No, excellent. That is a lovely point to finish on. Thank you very much. I will wrap up the conversation there. Thank you very much for sticking around for this episode of Ammonia Energy Live. Thank you very much to our live audience for coming along. Thank you very much to Lily. Thank you for getting through 2 children and a country internet. It is just the reality of how we work these days, and it's been a really, really good conversation with a lot of really good points.
Thanks so much, everyone. Thanks for listening, and apologies for my children again.
No, it's all good. Stay tuned for further details of future episodes of Ammonia Energy Live. It's nice to be back. We do have a very interesting webinar next month coming on renewable ammonia projects in Northwest Africa, and we've got a maritime safety webinar in the works as well. And you will get those details all through your inbox and through our newsletter. But for this afternoon, I will say thank you very much for coming along to Ammonia Energy Live, and I'll see everyone later. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Lily.